Let's start with a word of prayer. Lord, we're thankful that we can all be together tonight and look at the things that the scriptures say, look at the things that your son had to say, um, and that your word had to say to us. I pray that we would take these things to heart and give things thought. Lord, I guess one of the biggest things I know for me is just to keep in mind who we are throughout the day. It's so easy today, as it probably always has been, but I live today. So today it seems difficult sometimes to keep my mind grounded where it should be with all the different things that come at you. But Lord, I know I need help with it, so I'm sure other people need help. The more that we can keep grounded in you and keep you in our minds and thoughts, the better we can serve you and serve others around us and shine for you and your son. Amen. All right, so tonight we're going to be talking about responding to enemies number 4. And the topic this evening is going to be reconfiguration. Kind of a strange word for people. I think of reconfiguring as computers, or when I was in the Air Force, sometimes we would reconfigure the loads on the planes I worked on, depending on their missions. But it's a similar idea for us. We are programmed in a certain way. We've lived a certain way, been raised different ways. We live in a particular society, and all of that has bearing on our minds in the way that we live, whether we think so or not. But God has a plan, and that plan for it to work, or for it to work in our lives, because God's plan will work, but for us to be partners in it and for it to work in us, we have to change how we think about things. And we're going to start off in Matthew chapter 5, and we're going to read verses 13 to 16. So this is in the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount, and it's towards the beginning. I guess it's kind of like part of I like to think of it as the introduction to what is coming in the sermon, part of the introduction. And he says, "You are the salt of the earth, but if the salt has become tasteless, how can it be made salty again? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled underfoot by men. You are the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden, nor does anyone light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on the lampstand, and it gives light to all those who are in the house. Let your light shine before men in such a way that they may see your good works and glorify your Father who is in heaven." I think I did something a while ago, I don't know how long ago, or I mentioned these verses and talked about salt and what the salt was. But as I read these, and we're talking about reconfiguration, these verses might mean to us, as we read them and then we think about ourselves and how we're living, or how we perceive ourselves as relation to the kingdom or to God, that we might need to change some of how we're thinking. We need to change our way of living. We need to see the world around us a little differently. I believe that is exactly here what Jesus is starting to preface what he's going to talk about, to tell them, I need you, if you're going to be a follower of me, if you're going to be a disciple, because that's who he's talking to, his disciples, which isn't just his 12, but people that follow him. And he's telling them, I have something for you. And this is the way that you've been, and this is the way that I need you to start being. He's saying he needs them to repent, which is just a change. He needs them to look different than the status quo around them in the Roman Empire, in the Jewish world. different from the crowds, different from the systems of the world, and he needs them to shine. The earth and its inhabitants, Jesus is saying, who are his disciples, right? They're people that live on the earth. There's some of the inhabitants, and in specifically here, he's mostly talking to the Jewish system, has become tasteless. Now, remember, if you remember back when I talked about it before, the salt he's referring to here isn't salt that you salt your food with. This is a salt that's raw from the ground, full of minerals and nutrients, and it's put into whatever they're going to mix it with, animal dung or what have you, composting, and they're going to mix all that together with the salt, and it's going to help feed its nutrients into the fertilizer that they're making. And if the fertilizer, who was what Israel was supposed to be, or in this case, the Jews, if they had become devoid of nutrients, then whatever is going to be planted in them is going to be devoid of nutrients, and it's not going to grow, or it's going to grow stunted. Sometimes if you're growing vegetables and the leaves start to yellow, there's different reasons, but one of the reasons they start to yellow was a lack of certain minerals that are in the soil. And so these folks are stuck in a rut, and it's become the same thing over and over and over again. And there's a lack of growth. And so God wants believers to help to fertilize. That's what he's telling them. If you're going to be salt, you can't be tasteless, because if you're tasteless, then it's pointless. God does not want to eliminate everyone and start over again. He doesn't want to eliminate people. He doesn't want to take people and say, you're no good, I'm throwing you out. He wants to reconfigure them, to change them, to get them to change so that they can do what they were made to do, what they were made for. And that's what God's ultimate goal is in each person's life, to get them to change their thought processes, to get them to be flavorful, as Jesus says, or be able to be a shining light, as he says also. You don't put a bushel over a light so you can't see. That would make no sense. You turn the light on so that you can see the dark room, or the dark world, lights in the world. Paul uses the same analogy in Corinthians, a little bit differently, but in 1 Corinthians chapter 3 in verses 6-9, when Paul is talking to the Corinthians about they're trying to choose him or Apollos or somebody else, and who they follow, and he's trying to tell them, well, you follow God. We all have a part in things, and he talks about that part a little bit. He says that I planted, Apollos watered, but God was causing the growth. So then neither the one who plants nor the one who waters is anything, but God who causes the growth. Now he who plants and he who waters are one, but each will receive his own reward according to his labor. For we are God's fellow workers. You are God's field, God's building. So as a field, they need to be well fertilized because something's being planted in it. God is causing the growth, but Paul and Apollos are both working toward the end that the people would grow. It's God's work, but we're partners in it. So if it's God's field, you think of God as a farmer, but he's not actually doing everything to have the farm necessarily grow, though it says he causes the growth, but he's hiring somebody to say, I want you to plant, and then I want you to go back through and water, and you keep doing that, and eventually it's going to grow. You can even say God is like the sun shining down, causing the plants to grow, and these other folks are helping getting it going. Jesus the Christ, I'll say it that way. I as I was thinking about it, I'm like, well, he spread the fertilizer. The fertilizer for the world to grow for God is found in Christ and the cross. And Paul is planting that seed, and that's what he talks about with everybody, is the cross and what Jesus has accomplished. And that is what the fertilizer is. And that's what we can be part of, because who is in us? If we want to say the fertilizer, well, the fertilizer is in you. And you got to let that work itself out. So I think it's more than, as I think I mentioned this past couple of weeks, it's more than stopping sinning as the things that we've called for. It's more than a call for better ethics or better morals. It's a call for a complete change, starting from the inside and working its way out. Let me scroll down here. So in a book, which which I think I read from last week, I don't know if I'm reading for it more tonight. Now I can't remember. A book called The Revolutionary Way of Jesus by a man named Preston Sprinkle. He said something that I read a while ago that, it kind of stuck with me. He says, if you're of the world, the sermon, being the Sermon on the Mount, will seem outlandish and impractical. And the reason that kind of struck me is because I've read other commentators and other people talk about Sermon on the Mount and take the things in the Sermon on the Mount and try to water them down or adopt them to human thinking, or saying, well, Jesus really wasn't expecting us to do this or that. And it just, I thought that way before when I read it. Well, this was just for those people or what have you, because it seems outlandish, some of the things he talks about, and impractical to life. And I think that's part of what Jesus is trying to tell them. The way you've been living and your view of the world and your view of God are skewed. They're skewed according to the world. That's why when I say these things to you, as he goes out and ministers, as he's saying stuff, and using if Paul and Peter and John are saying things, some of them seem a little outlandish and impractical. And we think, well, you can't live that way. I think the statement seems to correct us as believers on the surface. That's what it seems to do on the surface, but it definitely goes deeper than that. And we need to think, is it outlandish or practical? Is it? That's something that we ask ourselves. We just finished discussing, I think it was last week. Was I on last week or the week before? We talked about, my days are all just blending together recently. So we talked about being strangers to the world. And are we really strangers? I said is something that we need to ask ourselves sometimes. John 17:14, I think I read this last week. It says, I have given them your word, and the world has hated them, because they are not of the world, even as I am not of the world. They weren't of the world, neither should we be part of the world. And that's part of the reconfiguration that God is trying to drive into us, and change the way we think about things, because we're not part of the world anymore. As soon as we accept Christ, and he dwells in us, and the Spirit of God dwells in us, we're taken out. It's like as I just prayed, it's something I have to think about throughout the day. I am not of the world. If you, I know I've said I do this before, but I like to, and I can't think of his name now. Scott, my dad knows who he is, but Scott McKnight. One of the books I read by him talked about saying the Shema, and initially I thought, well, isn't that isn't that kind of like a work? Isn't that what Israel did, kind of a thing? But I kind of incorporate it into a prayer, depending on what I'm praying. But if you say it, you are my God, you are one. I love you with all my heart, all my soul, all my mind, with all that I am. Every time you say that, um, you're saying, I am no longer part of the world. Because if I am part of the world, and if I'm hanging on to the world, then God can't be one to me, because something else is pulling at me, and something else becomes one, and something else blocks all that out. And it's not, I mean, obviously it would be concerned to block God out, but the concern is that loving God with all my heart, soul, and mind, with all that I am, as Jesus says, the next statement is loving your neighbor as yourself. It flows from loving God to loving others. The purpose of loving God in that statement is, if God, I'm loving you and I'm keeping you in the forefront, and I'm doing that with all my heart, soul, mind, and all that I am, then it should translate over to how I am around other people. You're stating before God that you will follow God's ways. And some of those ways were magnified in the human life of Jesus and his apostles and disciples, and written out for us to read and follow. And also, I'm not saying you have to go home and get up every morning and say the Shema. I mean, you work it how you want to. I just find it something helpful for myself to make sure it's something that I keep, and say in the mornings at least, or sometimes not till the afternoon if I forget. But it's a way of reconfiguration, bringing you back down to where you're supposed to be and who you're supposed to be. 2 Timothy chapter 2 and verses 3 and 4. Now, I sometimes in the mornings I listen to the Bible instead of reading. I have an awesome app that I use. It's pretty cheap, but I pay for it every year. But it's cool, and it's got readings of all different translations by different people. And this morning, as I was reading or listening, it says, "Suffer hardship with me as a good soldier of Christ." And the line that jumped out at me was, "No soldier in active service entangles himself in the affairs of everyday life, so that he may please the one who enlisted him as a soldier." As a soldier in active service, I don't believe that Paul here is talking about being a member of the military. I was in the Air Force. I didn't always have to disentangle myself from daily life, because sometimes, depending on the service you're in or what's going on at the moment, your orders and stuff, you go to work and then you go home. I went to work. I went back to my dorm. I had a roommate. We stayed up all hours of the night watching the late night show and other things, and life was life until I got up the next day and went to work. Had to be all in uniform, line up. We got our briefing and got our jobs and the yes sirs and all that kind of stuff. That's when life reverted to, you're in the military. I mean, you're always in the military and you're expected to act certain ways. But I think Paul is going beyond that. I think he's talking about men that are in active service, men that are actually at war, fighting, which was a constant in Rome. The things of the world can't hold on to your attention when you're in those situations, because the consequence is not to disentangle yourself from the affairs of the world. When you're a soldier, it could mean the life of yourself. It could mean the life of the man next to you. It could mean the loss of an objective, which might be saving a town or holding a line. It could mean a lot of things. And so, when you first get in the military and you go into basic training, the first thing they do is start screaming at you and shave your head so that they can say, you are no longer you. I'm going to mold you into what I need you to be so that you could serve us 1,000%, and not yourself. And so they're reconfiguring you from one way of life into another. And Paul uses this because I think he's trying to tell Timothy, don't give up. Keep the ministry going. And he uses this example. You need, Timothy, to think of yourself as an active soldier and let go of the affairs and concerns of the world. Paul is not telling them, quit your job, stop eating, only dress a certain way, sell your house. He's telling him all the things that go around in the world you need to let go of because you're here for a reason, and it's very important that you keep going on with that. And so as citizens of God's kingdom, I believe we need to make sure we are disentangling ourselves from the worldly structures and powers and those types of things that can pull us away from who we're supposed to be. So in the next section, we're going to go back to the Sermon on the Mount. So you can turn over to Matthew chapter 5, and we're going to read just a few of the "you have heard it said" statements. And these reference to our topic, which is responding to enemies, or the topic of nonviolence. There are 6 references in the sermon where Jesus used the phrase, "You have heard it said, but I say." I think all of these statements, one thing they're meant to do is reconfigure the thinking and the worldview and the people view of those who are his disciples, and all the people that are listening. This is what you knew. This is what your world said. Now I'm going to take that and I'm going to change it a little bit, and I want you to see it this way. The way of ancient Israel, which was largely like the way of the world, unfortunately. He has a new way for them. So I think Matthew chapter 5, if you just want to start with them, I'm not going to read them, but verses 3 through 10, the Beatitudes, right there, I think you have a reconfiguration right from the start. The statement that the meek are going to inherit the earth makes no sense, right? If we look at the world today, do you think the meek are inheriting the earth? No. Most people would say, well, the meek are getting walked over, trampled over, and they're not going to inherit anything. What about being poor in spirit? Who wants to be poor in spirit? Some people would say that's no way to go around in the world. The same with peacemaking. Peacemaking. Of course, we all say, well, we want peace, and we try to live peaceably and make peace with people. But we see all the time where it doesn't seem to be always the norm. And some people will say, there's no way I can have peace with that person, or there's no way we can have peace with that group of people, or that society, or that culture, or that nation, because they're a certain way. So peacemaking, we'll try it at first, we'll see, but I'm pretty sure it's going to end up different. So, what is Jesus talking about? He's saying, think differently. Think differently. Most of the self-proclaimed messiahs in Jesus' day, of which there were some. Actually, I've read there was a lot. There's a few that were written in history books, like Josephus, that we would say made the news. But most self-proclaimed messiahs chose the way of the world to set up God's kingdom, just like Israel did in the Old Testament. They chose the way of the world to continue their nation instead of trusting and having faith in God. And so the way to set up a kingdom back in those days, when they were setting up kingdoms, we're probably pretty much set in the world today with with who was who. But at that point, as they were expanding still and going out into different lands, you set up kingdoms by overthrowing something that was already there. If you went there and you thought they're savages, they need to be ruled, they need to be civilized, what did you do? Well, you went in. What did Rome do? They went in with the military and they fought the people that were there, and they brought them into the empire. You definitely didn't follow the Beatitudes or the things that Jesus is going to say in the "You have heard it said, but I say." The way to maintain a kingdom was to absorb your enemies into your way of thinking. And if they wouldn't come into your way of thinking, then you fought them and tried to overtake them and force them into your way of thinking. Again, Jesus is saying those ways are not the correct ways. Those are the ways of the world. So in verses 7 through 12 of Matthew 5, peacemaking and suffering are going to become kind of a bedrock to the kingdom. In the world's way of thinking, these ways are going to be the collapse of a kingdom. They're not going to maintain what's supposed to be going on. They are, at least, should be part of our foundation. You think of peacemaking. I think of Romans 5. The cross was the peacemaker. It was a foundation. And what did the cross do in Romans 5? Well, it removed the status of enemy. It did it without having to go out and trample on people or cause destruction or forcefully move anybody in a certain direction. It did it through suffering and even death and persecution. And some people might not want anything to do with such a kingdom. Some Christians might not want anything to do with such a kingdom, let alone people who are not believers. So everything I just talked about, what I'm going forward with here in the next few minutes, you might think, well, right, Dan, I'm a Christian. Of course I believe that or think that. But is that how we live our lives? Is it what is displayed by us? What is it displayed by Christianity as a whole? We can say we believe in something, or we can say, well, yeah, I read that and I believe Jesus. But is that really what happens? So we'll start in Matthew chapter 5, and we're going to read verses 21 and 22. You have heard that the ancients were told, you shall not commit murder, and whoever commits murder shall be liable to the court. But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother shall be guilty before the court. And whoever says to his brother, you good for nothing, shall be guilty before the Supreme Court. And whoever says, you fool, shall be guilty enough to go into the fiery hell. So, what is he saying? Obviously, murder is wrong, right? I think most people will agree it's wrong for someone to walk into a place and rob it, and in the process of robbing it, they kill somebody. That's murder. Or we think of serial killers who go around murdering people, or all different types of murder. We think they're wrong. The taking of human life. We would most of us, hopefully, would say that's wrong. This is a strong statement by Jesus, I think anyways. And I wonder what the people who were listening thought of what he was saying. He is speaking of what I read by a commentator to be contemptuous anger and insults. And he is equating those with murder. I mean, we all have heard the phrase, words can kill, right? When he says good for nothing, if you're angry, you're going to go to court. If you say you're good for nothing, you're going to the Supreme Court. If you say fool, you're going to go to the fiery hell. He's not saying that each one of those things is worse than the other. it's a progression that he's saying. They're all things that you shouldn't be saying, and he's trying to drive a point home. In a book called The Sermon on the Mount, The Message of the Kingdom by a man named A.B. Bruce, I'm just going to read what he had to say about this statement, because of all the things and commentaries and stuff that I looked at, I really liked what he had to say. He said raka, which would be fool. Some Bibles might just say raka. Raka expresses contempt for a man's head. It equals you stupid! Exclamation point. More expresses contempt for his heart and character, such as you scoundrel. These two words were not terms of endearment, but of malignant contempt. Jesus here condemns angry contempt and all its cousins: animosity, malice, hostility, malevolence, and wrath. He is not suggesting a ladder of offenses that result in progressively sterner judgments, as if anger gets a minor judgment, raka a stiffer penalty, and fool gets hell. He is simply multiplying examples to make his point. And the point is, all such animosity can land one in hell. I think the idea that Jesus might be trying to point out, part of an idea, is that people feel justified when they get their vengeance or revenge or whatever against somebody else, or if they're angry with someone by berating them. Well, I didn't do anything physically. I didn't hit them. I didn't beat them. I didn't kill them. So, it's just some words. Big deal. I was just expressing how I feel. And I think what Jesus is saying is, guess what? When you do that, you're deserving of judgment, because you're basically killing that person, spiritually, emotionally. Mr. Bruce continues. He says that some commentators suggest a number of more contemporary substitutes, like numbskull, nitwit, blockhead, bonehead, jerk, or brainless idiot. You could think of any words, right? Moron. Lisa and I have been watching for a long time now. We've been hooked on UK crime dramas, and we've picked up all kinds of little words like that, such as git. They'll call each other gits or don't be a git. And I looked them up on my phone to see, well, what does that mean? And they just mean things that we say, nitwit, moron, stuff like that. And I think, sometimes we get angry and we tend to say things like that, or even think things like that. And we can all think of other words that we would use. The basic premise is that we are trying to reduce somebody's standing in our eyes, and maybe even their own eyes of themselves, and reduce them to nothing or as low as possible. And so when I think about it that way, then I guess that in some way, shape, or form, we're all considered murderers, because I know we all do it. I'll admit that, I think that way often, not proudly, but sometimes I do. And now, I got to try to stop myself and say, I can't even say things like that or think things like that, because it's not right. In Matthew chapter 5, verses 38 to 41, it says, "You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist an evil person, but whoever slaps you on your right cheek, turn the other to him also. If anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, let them have your coat also. Whoever forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2." And I've talked about these verses at least a couple times over the past year. There are many, if you read different commentators, they have different things to say, different opinions about this particular section. But Jesus is likely referring to what many cultures at the time, just like the Jews, if you backhanded somebody, it was a form of contempt. It was a form of reducing someone to nothing, just like contemptuous words. So if a man had a servant or a slave or a child or even a friend, and they said something he didn't like, or they didn't do something the way he wanted to, and he backhands them across the face, that is a strong form of contempt. According to rabbinic law, to strike someone with the backhand was twice as insulting as slapping them with an open palm. One person I read said that if you slap someone with the backhand, generally it was the right hand. And if they then had to turn around and backhand you again with their left hand, that it was actually an insult to them because you had refused what they were saying, and for them to have to use both hands was some type of insult. Thankfully, we don't go around backhanding people today for such reasons, such things. But Jesus is saying, if you are struck that way, turn your other cheek, because now they're going to have to come at you with an open palm, which is less as insulting as the other. And I think Jesus is also trying to get across, you're pushing a point to them that they can't reduce you and insult you, because their backhand means something to them and nothing to you anymore, because you have left that way of thinking behind, and you don't do that. You don't speak that way. You don't do these things, and whatever they're doing to you, it's not taking you down. And so to make them try to hit you again or do the same thing again, and standing there in that way is also somewhat degrading, becomes degrading to them, and starts to show them who they are and what they're doing. So the point here, you could also say Paul, when he says, at the end of Romans chapter 12, if you feed your enemy and you clothe your enemy and you give them water when they're thirsty, it's like pouring burning coals over their head, because it's not what they expect. They're the enemy. They expect you to treat them like an enemy. When you treat them out of love and respect, it burns in them, because it shows them who they've become. And so there is no retaliation according to these verses. You have heard that if you do something that causes someone to lose their eye, which is Old Testament, then you have the same thing done to you. If you accidentally chop someone's arm off, then you get your arm chopped off. I mean, Jesus is saying there is none of that. You just turn the other cheek, or you offer the other. And so these are important, I think, admonishments, not just to the people who heard the Sermon on the Mount, not just to the old Jewish thinking or the ancient way of thinking, but to people everywhere. And again, Paul said in Romans 12 the same thing. We don't take revenge. We do what's right in the sight of all men. We don't do what's right according to what they think. We do what's right according to what God thinks. And some people will say, well, this seems to be radical teaching. I mean, I've heard that before from people, and there's no way I would do that. Because the inclination of the human mind and our old nature is, I'm getting back at everybody that does something wrong to me. I'm going to do it as soon as possible. And even if I have to scheme and think about it and get my revenge at a later time, I'm going to make sure that happens, because I'm pretty upset with them. And Jesus is saying that type of thinking has no place in a believer's heart. And if we go down to verses 43 and 45, it says, you have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven. For he causes the sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. So in an NASB, you shall love your neighbor is all in caps. And the reason that is because it comes right from the Old Testament. But and hate your enemy is in all lowercase, because you actually can't find that in the law, to go out and hate your neighbor or hate your enemy. So this is out of all the laws here, that the six that Jesus is turning upside down, is one that is not completely found in the Old Testament. The hate your enemy part, I learned, was added in. I used to think it's just what they heard from everybody else in the world, but apparently it was added in into some rabbinical teaching by the religious and political establishment. Jews loved Jews. I mean, you could read through the Old Testament and read what they thought of those people around them, and even in the New Testament, the Jews loved only the Jews. Their neighbors were the Jews in their minds. The rest were worthless. They were not worth anything, and many of them hated them. Many of them even believed that God hated the rest of them. But Jesus states that to love your enemy is part of being a son of God, which we are. We're children of God. So loving our enemies is part of who we are. This is not the human kind of love, which might say, kill your enemy as a way of loving someone else, or even as a way of loving the enemy by graciously ending their lives so that they will stop their evil ways. Killing, according to this passage at least, is forbidden for the believer or follower of Christ. And I think we read a couple of weeks ago when I brought forth the things that the early church taught about this. That's what the early church believed, up to the point of Constantine, where things drastically changed for the stand of who the church was. Some people might say, and I brought this up before, well, killing for love of country certainly has to be excluded from that. And as we learned, the early church, and I believe, no, it's not excluded from it. Followers of Christ, believers, which is what a Christian is. A Christian is someone who follows the teachings of Christ, follows the ways of God, and that is not acceptable. What do? We find radical ways to change hearts and minds of enemies, and we never cease doing that. We do it not just by what we might say to enemies, but the way that we live. And that's the way of the cross, which is, as Paul says, is what? Foolishness to the world. Just like Mr. Preston, as we just read a few minutes ago, that he said, the average person of the world is going to read the Sermon on the Mount and think it's not practical, that it's outlandish, and it's foolish. In the book I just read a moment ago from Mr. Bruce, Sermon on the Mount, The Message of the Kingdom, he says, another reason I think that they added "and hate your enemy" is the natural human perversity that tends to counter a strong positive statement with a negative counterpart. That is sublimely elevated statement, "You shall love your neighbor," stated categorically, invites the negative corollary, "Yeah, and hate your enemy." You can equate it to a lot of things. You're talking to someone, they're telling you how much they love white pizza with whole garlic cloves on it, which I love. It's delicious. The garlic cloves are so sweet. Someone else might say, well, yeah, I like pizza with pepperoni, and I hate the one with garlic. That's just how people think, right? I love the Buffalo Bills, and I hate the New York Jets. And, that's how we talk. And I think what he's saying here, this man is saying, is that it's natural. Those are both harmless examples. But in Jesus' mind, what he's saying is that it got to a point where if you had an enemy, there was extreme hatred toward them. but whoever was your neighbor, you loved. And of course, you know what he said about that, right? Later in the Sermon on the Mount, he says, or it might even be right after the passage, and I can't remember, but he says, you love. You love your enemies. If you don't love your enemies and you only love those people who are your family or your neighbors, well, how is that different than anybody else? Everybody loves somebody. You got to be different. And how are you different? What's the reconfiguration saying? It's bringing us away from the common thought. Just a couple interesting things here about enemies. From Deuteronomy 22, 1 through 4, you don't have to turn there because we're getting short here, but it says, you shall not see your countryman's ox or his sheep straying away and pay no attention to them. You shall certainly bring them back to your countrymen. If your countryman is not near you, or you do not know him, then you shall bring it into your house, and it shall remain with you until your countryman looks for it. Then you shall restore it to him. Thus shall you do with his donkey, and you shall do the same with his garment. And you shall do likewise with anything lost by your countryman, which he has lost, and you have found. You are not allowed to neglect them. You shall not see your countryman's donkey or his ox fallen down on the way and pay no attention to them. You shall certainly help him rise them up. So basically, if my neighbor's dog gets loose, then I need to help collect the dog or find the dog myself and then walk over to their house and knock on the door and say, hey, your dog is loose. Here they are. That would be a responsible thing to do. I don't even know my neighbor that moved in a while ago, but they have 2 dogs and they're beautiful dogs. But if one gets loose, of course, I love dogs. I'm going to try to get their dog back. It could be anything like that. He says donkeys, oxen, garments, clothing. Someone drops a wallet. What is your job? Your job is to pick the wallet up, not take the money out, and take it and try to find the person. I dropped my phone once. I left it on top of the car years ago, and it fell and smashed. And someone down 237 was on their morning run, and they found my phone. And after some working, they were able to get it to work again, even though it was all smashed up. And they called me and said, hey, we found your phone, which is nice. Not everybody does that. And so they're being told that's the responsibility for their countrymen. Obviously, it's their countrymen. Well, in Exodus 23:4, it says, if you meet your enemy's ox or his donkey wandering away, you shall surely return it to him. Most people might be thinking, well, if I find my enemy's cattle, why wouldn't I keep it for myself? Why wouldn't I just rebrand it? That would just add to us. Besides, they're an enemy. I don't need to do anything nice for them. I hate my enemy. So I'm going to do whatever I can to make things more difficult for them. And the law said, no, even if your enemy loses something, you need to make the effort to return it to them. And what I said before about Jesus is Matthew 5:46. He says, for if you love those who love you, what reward do you have? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? So if you're the countryman returning his stuff, something someone lost to them, then you should also be doing it to your enemy. Because if you do that, then you're taking the next step that's expected. It's that reconfiguration. The act of helping others, even those we consider enemies, is an act of love. And what is love? Thomas Ord has a great book about that, and he defines love as desiring the well-being of all people, and actually acting towards that well-being. All people, doesn't matter who they are. This is an act of cruciformity. And what did Jesus do as the Christ? He effectively eliminated the word enemy on the cross. It's interesting when you read that in Romans 5. If you think about it, Christ has zero enemies. Zero. And, think it through. He lives in me. He expects me to live as he lived. So what does that mean for me? I have no enemies. I shouldn't have any enemies. That doesn't mean I don't have enemies, because I'm human and I think certain ways. I'm not saying I've made the grade or anything, because I haven't, but I'm just sharing with you that Christ has no enemies. Some people might say, well, yeah, he still has the demons and Satan and all that. Well, fine. If that's what you want to think, then Christ has no human enemies. And so what are they teaching us? They're teaching us, Paul and Jesus, and even Peter, 1 Peter chapter 2 especially, they're teaching us different ways to deal with other people. They're giving us alternative ways to deal with enemies, or those who degrade us. And these ways may result in suffering. They may result in my suffering. They may result in the suffering of someone else. The suffering may or may not include emotional and or physical acts or issues. The suffering might result in my loss for another's gain. But it is meant to show others who Christ is. And Paul says in Galatians 2:20, and we'll wrap up here, he says, I have been crucified with Christ, and it is no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me. And the life which I now live, the life which I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself up for me. I've been reading Richard Rohr, The Universal Christ, and I started listening to his podcast as well that goes along with that book on Spotify. And a couple of weeks ago, I listened to it, and he said something at first I was not sure about. He said, we are incarnate. And, he says, don't be afraid to say that. We just want to think of Jesus being incarnate because he's divine. He's God's son, and God dwelt in him, and what Jesus and God did together. But God, Spirit, dwells in us. Christ dwells in us. We are with them. They're in us. We are in them. That's the definition of what it means to be incarnate. If we truly, if you think about that, whether you're willing to believe that or not, or think about it in that way, I started thinking, I'm like, well, if I really believe that way, then how should I really be living? Because if Christ is with me and God is with me, and I know I'm forgiven in the cross, and they don't see my sin, which is why I believe a lot of the things he has to say go beyond just sin. Would that change your life? If you really think about that, and that's what I'm trying to wrap my head around and think about. If I really believe that every day, how much is it going to change my life? It's like thinking that Christ is walking step by step with me every day. Here's everything I say and see the things I do in relation to how I treat others, and loving enemies. He sees that and experiences that with me. Would it make me or cause me to change at least a little bit in who I was, and reconfiguring my mind and my outlook on the world and other people, and exactly who I am supposed to be for him? And that's where I'm going to leave it. And I will ask if anybody has anything to add or ask. Oh, I see there's a chat note here.
Dan?
It says, it is true, we are incarnate. See Ernest Holmes.
Oh, there you go.
Of the Mind. And that's from my Uncle Tim and Aunt Sandy.
Yeah.
Amen.
Amen.
We are. I believe we are. He's here with us right now, not just with us, but we're part of him and he's part of us. And,
Amen.
you know,
Amen.
it's all right there. All right, folks. Well, I hope you have a great rest of the week, and I hope you give this some thought and reconfigure your mind in his kingdom, because that's where we are and who we are. And hopefully that is something that works out for you and other people can see, because that's the ultimate goal while we're here and building our character. So that will wrap it up, and hopefully we'll see you all Sunday morning.